The drive back from Kenora was supposed to take 7 hours. I made it in 5.5 because I couldn't sleep and the roads were empty, and somewhere around Dryden I stopped pretending I wasn't worried. My daughter hadn't called me back in 4 days. That wasn't like her. Marisol called every Sunday without fail. Had done it since she was 14 when I first started taking long-haul contracts up north. Even when she was angry with me, and there were years when she had every reason to be, she still called, even if it was just to say she was fine and then hang up. The call always came. I'd left 3 voicemails, sent 2 texts. Her husband had read the messages. I could see the check marks, and hadn't responded. That bothered me more than anything. I pulled into my driveway at 6:20 in the morning. The porch light at my house was on because I'd left it on a timer. Everything looked the same. I sat in the truck for a minute before going inside. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I called her cell phone again and it went to voicemail after 2 rings, which meant she declined it. That was new. I'd been doing pipeline inspection work in Northwestern Ontario for going on 9 years. 12, sometimes 14 days at a stretch in camps with limited signal. The arrangement had always worked because Marisol was grown, she had her own life, and I was only a few years from paying off this house and calling it done. The plan was to retire at 62, maybe 63, do some fishing, visit her more. She was 31. She'd married a man named Dwight 2 years ago in a small ceremony outside of Hamilton. I'd walked her down the aisle. I'd danced with her at the reception. I hadn't trusted Dwight exactly. There was something too careful about the way he spoke, like every sentence had been rehearsed. But I told myself I was being a protective father, and that was normal, and I should mind my own business. I called my sister in Sudbury instead. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she already knew something. "When did you get back?" she said. "This morning." "Helen." "Where is Marisol?" "She's not at home," my sister said. "I know she's not at home. She's not picking up. Where is she?" Another pause. I heard her exhale. Dwight said she needed help. That she was struggling. He told the family she checked herself in somewhere voluntarily, some kind of private wellness program. He said she asked for space and not to tell you because you'd overreact. I set my coffee cup down very carefully. "When?" I said. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I had been in a work camp with intermittent satellite internet for 3 weeks, and my daughter had disappeared into some private facility, and her husband had told my family it was voluntary and not to tell me. "Where is this place?" I said. He didn't say exactly. Somewhere outside of Orangeville, I think. He mentioned it was. "Did you ask for an address?" Silence. "Helen," he said she didn't want visitors, that it was part of the program. I believed him. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." I hung up. I'm not proud of that, but I hung up. I sat at the table for another 10 minutes. I was thinking about the last time I'd actually seen Marisol in person, which was 5 months ago at Thanksgiving. She'd been quieter than usual. She'd laughed at the right moments, but the laugh didn't reach her eyes the way it used to. I'd noticed it and I'd filed it away and told myself it was nothing because I didn't want it to be something. I thought about how Dwight had answered every question at dinner before she could. Not in an obvious way. In a way that looked like consideration, like he was being helpful. I pulled up my laptop and searched for private residential wellness programs near Orangeville, Ontario. There were 4 within a reasonable radius. 2 of them had professional-looking websites with stock photos and vague language about transformation and guided growth. One was clearly for addiction recovery, which I didn't think applied. The 4th had a name I didn't recognize, Clearwater Perspectives, and almost no online presence, which I found strange. I wrote down the address from the business registration database. It took me 40 minutes to find it that way, but I found it. I got back in the truck. The address led me down a county road I'd never been on, past a series of properties with long laneways and no signs. I almost missed the turnoff. There was a small placard mounted on a wooden post, white letters on brown background, easy to overlook, that said Clearwater Perspectives Limited, and below it in smaller letters, residential programming for adults. The laneway was gravel, maybe 300 meters long. It opened onto a property that looked like it had once been a private estate. A large main building, what looked like a converted barn, and several smaller outbuildings arranged around a central open area. There were raised garden beds. A few people were moving around outside in the early morning, doing what looked like chores. I parked and got out. A man came out of the main building before I reached the door. He was wearing a fleece vest with a logo on it. He looked like he'd been expecting someone to show up eventually. "Can I help you?" he said. "I'm looking for my daughter. Her name is Marisol." His expression didn't change, which told me everything. "We don't confirm or deny residency," he said. "If you have concerns about a family member, I can connect you with our family intake coordinator." "I don't want an intake coordinator," I said. "I want to see my daughter." "Sir, our residents are here voluntarily and their privacy is. She's 31 years old and her husband put her here without telling anyone in her family." I've had no contact with her in 3 weeks. I'm her father, and I want to see her. We have signed consent documentation for all our residents, the man said. Your daughter's participation here is fully voluntary. Something about the way he said it, too smooth, too prepared, made me feel like I was going to be sick. I'm not leaving, I said. I don't know how long I stood there. At some point a woman came out, older, with the kind of careful professional manner I associated with mediators. She introduced herself as the program director. She said the same things the man had said, only more gently. She offered me tea. She showed me a clipboard with what she said was a voluntary intake form. I asked to see the form with Marisol's signature. She hesitated for half a second, just half a second. But I saw it. I'd like to call the OPP, I said. I'd like them to come here and confirm that my daughter is here of her own choosing and that she's in good health. If she is, I'll leave. You can tell her I was here and let her decide if she wants to see me. The director's expression shifted slightly. Not much. 15 minutes later, Marisol came out of the converted barn. She was wearing clothes I didn't recognize. Plain institutional looking, the kind of thing you'd be given rather than choose. She had lost weight that she didn't have to lose. Her hair was pulled back in a way she never wore it. She stopped when she saw me. She stood there for a moment like she was trying to understand what she was seeing, then she started walking toward me. Fast. I met her halfway across the gravel. She held on for a long time. I could feel how thin she was. I didn't say anything. I just stood there. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet and she looked at me like she was checking to make sure I was real. Dad, she said, Dwight told them you signed off. He said you agreed to this. He said you thought it was for the best. I felt something go cold and quiet inside me. I never signed anything, I said. I didn't know where you were. She looked at me, and I could see something rearranging itself in her expression. The way a person looks when a lie they've been told for weeks suddenly stops making sense. He said you thought I needed. She stopped. He said you'd agreed. I've been trying to call you for 4 days. I drove straight here from Kenora. I've been out of my mind. She put her hand over her mouth. She'd been there 23 days. She'd arrived believing she was coming for a 2-week voluntary stay. Dwight had presented it as a wellness retreat, something to help with anxiety, something they discussed together. He'd driven her. He'd carried her bag inside. He'd told her he'd call every day. He called twice in the first week, then stopped. When she'd asked staff to contact me directly, she was told that her treatment plan included a communication hold, that her family had agreed to it as part of her intake. She'd believed it because Dwight had told her I thought the program was a good idea. She'd thought I agreed she needed to be there. She thought I knew. She'd spent 3 weeks in that place, thinking her own father had decided she needed to be managed. I got her out that morning. I put her in the truck. She didn't have much. Her phone had been collected as part of the program's device policy. But the director returned it when I asked, which told me they knew exactly how this was going to look. We drove for a while without talking. She had her hands in her lap. She was looking out the window at the fields. I kept thinking, she said, that maybe he was right, that maybe I had been. She stopped again. They have a way of making you feel like your own perceptions aren't reliable, like you need them to interpret your own feelings for you. That's not help, I said. No, she said, it isn't. I called my sister and told her Marisol was with me. I called a family lawyer I'd used for my divorce years ago. He referred me to someone who handled what he called coercive control cases, which I hadn't known was a legal category until that day. Marisol stayed at my house for 2 weeks. She slept in her old room. I made eggs in the morning because that's what I knew how to make, and she ate them without complaint. We watched a lot of bad television in the evenings. She had appointments. There were days she didn't want to talk and I didn't push. Dwight called 4 times in the first week. She didn't pick up. He left a voicemail explaining that he'd done it out of concern, that he'd been worried about her, that he hoped she understood. He sounded like a man explaining why he'd done you a favor that you hadn't asked for. I called him back. Once. I told him that I knew what he'd told the staff about me. I told him I had spoken to a lawyer. I told him I had the voicemail he'd left and that I intended to keep it. He didn't say much. The legal process was slow, the way legal processes always are in Canada. There was no single dramatic courtroom moment. There was documentation, statements, an assessment conducted by a social worker, conversations between lawyers. Marisol filed for divorce in November, 7 months after I'd brought her home. She'd found a therapist in Hamilton who specialized in recovery from coercive relationships. That's the formal term, coercive control. And the more I read about it, the more I recognized every phase of what Dwight had done with the patience of someone who'd been working on it for years. Clearwater Perspectives was referred to the Ministry of Health's compliance office. They were not licensed as a psychiatric facility, which meant their intake documentation had no legal standing. They had, according to investigators, accepted several placements in the previous year where the voluntary consent documentation was, at minimum, procedurally irregular. The program director resigned. The facility closed 8 months later. I don't know exactly what will happen to Dwight. The law is complicated when the harm is psychological and incremental and documented mostly in patterns, rather than incidents. What I know is that Marisol is in her own apartment now. She has a job she likes. She calls every Sunday without fail. A few months after everything settled, she came up to Sudbury for a weekend. My sister made a roast. We sat around the table the way we used to when she was small, when her mother was still around, when things were easier. She'd brought flowers. Not fancy ones, just whatever was on sale at the grocery store near the highway, still wrapped in plastic with the sticker showing. I teased her about them. She told me they were gas station flowers and that gas station flowers were the best kind because at least they were honest. After dinner, she helped me clear the table. We did the dishes, standing side by side the way we had when she was a teenager and I was between contracts and there was still time for things like that. She handed me a plate to dry and she said, without looking at me, that she was glad I'd come. I said I would have driven twice as far. She didn't say anything. Just handed me another plate. That was enough.